Alright guys, this is the Reformation in less time than it takes me to get to work. Remember, as we go through this, it's more or less the main points of it. It's going to be what caused it, the events and the major players of it, and what came about because of it. Not a substitute for full study. It's not going to go as in-depth as stuff that we do in class, but it's a good starting point for when you start studying. So here's the first thing we got to figure out. What was the Reformation? And it's pretty simple. It just boils down to a movement where people wanted to reform the Catholic Church. And we'll be talking about a guy named Martin Luther who kind of spearheaded this thing a little bit later on. Just a little background of it to kind of set the tone for you. In this time period that we're dealing with, and we're talking like the 1500s here, if you were a member of the Christian church in Europe, you were Catholic. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. What we'll be talking about as we go through this is how the Catholic Church ends up splitting and becoming different denominations after the process and the events of the Reformation. So before we get to the actual events of the Reformation and the main players in it, let's figure out what caused it. And number one on our list is a general loss of faith that people were having in the church at this time. There were a couple of different reasons this was happening. Number one, they had just recently, and by recently I mean for the last couple of hundred years, had come out of the Black Plague. I mean, you're talking about a time period when over half of the population of Europe died. So that, if nothing else, it's going to shake your confidence and shake your faith a little bit. When you take the effects of the Black Plague and you combine it with a period of time they're going through where crops are not working out nearly as well as they have before because of climatic change and because of a drought, then you throw famine on top of it. So all these things more or less combine to shake the confidence of people in the Catholic Church. Next on the list is a lot of new discoveries that are coming out of the Renaissance, and as a part of that, something called the scientific revolution, that are basically undermining or contradicting the teachings of the church. One of the greatest examples being the one that we talked about in the last section, which was the heliocentric theory by Galileo. Alright, so the last one on the list, and probably the most important from the point of view of the guy that we're going to talk about here in a second, was the general corruption that was happening in the church at this time. And more specifically, I'm talking about a system of things called indulgences. Now, here's the way indulgences work. If the Catholic Church needed money to build something, let's say a cathedral or whatever it is, they would send priests and friars and monks and people out into the countryside, and they would sell certificates that basically put you on the expressway to go to heaven. That's all it is, okay? People bought these things in the hopes that they would, or because they were promised, they would spend less time in purgatory and get to heaven more quickly. And they sold these things like crazy and made a ton of money while they were doing it. Alright, so now we get to the main players and the main events of the Reformation. And we're going to start off with a guy named John Tetzel, who was a Dominican friar who was sent by the Pope during this time to Germany to sell indulgences to raise money to build a cathedral in Rome. Simple as that, okay? So he's going in and he's selling these things to people all across the countryside in the hopes of raising money. Now, while Tetzel's going through the countryside selling these indulgences, he catches the attention of a guy named Martin Luther, who was a priest and a monk in the Catholic Church. Now, Luther had some problems with the church and some of the way that they were going about doing things and some of the teachings and all this. And through his own study of the Bible, he had come to a conclusion that none of the things that the Catholic Church did were necessary for salvation. Really, all you had to do was have faith. So he was basically saying that you didn't need to do things like indulgences. You didn't need to do things like they were doing. So here's the bottom line on it. Luther has these problems with the church, and he decides to not only write them down, he also decides to publicly air them. And he ends up nailing a list of 95 grievances or problems, which are known as the 95 Theses, as you can see on the screen, to the door of a church in an attempt to publicize the problems he has with the church. Alright, so Luther nails these 95 Theses to the door, and I'll give you one guess at what the reaction of the Catholic Church is to this, and it's not good. Now, it doesn't help that at the same time that Luther does this, the printing press has been introduced into Europe by a guy named Johann Gutenberg. And basically what the printing press did is it allowed written works to be mass produced on a scale like they haven't been able to do before. So instead of hand copying things down, you just put them on this machine and you got to knock them out on an unprecedented scale, like I said. Well, the best way to think about this is that the Reformation and the 95 Theses were the equivalent of a modern day YouTube video that goes viral. So that's all it is. Well, the church eventually calls Luther on the carpet, and they do this at a meeting called the Diet of Worms in 1520. And at this, Pope Leo X, who's in charge of the Catholic Church at this time, issues an order to Luther which tells him to basically repudiate his beliefs or give up his beliefs and quit trying to spread this thing. Well, Luther, in his response, decides he's going to burn this order, which, I mean, you can imagine how this did not sit too well with Pope Leo. In response to Luther burning this letter, Pope Leo excommunicates him, which, if you remember from before Christmas, basically means that you're not allowed to participate in church services anymore, and it basically denies you entry into heaven. So in response to that, Luther then hits the road and goes to the countryside and hides out for a while. And while he's there, he spends his time translating the works of the New Testament into German. One of the key things you've got to remember at this time is that most church or all church services and Bibles were printed in Latin. So when Luther starts translating this stuff into German or to the language of the people, they can now read the Bible for themselves and make their own judgments and own conclusions on how to get into heaven, much like he did when he read the Bible. Now, what this does is it ends up further weakening the church, because once people can read the words for themselves and make their own judgments, they really don't have to rely on the rituals, ceremonies, and everything associated with the church to get them into heaven. So at the end of the day, here's what ends up happening, or the major changes from the Reformation. The first and most obvious one is there is now a split in the church that still goes on to this day. On one side, you've got the Catholic component of Christianity, and on the other, you have the Protestant component. Now, the Protestant, the word, think about the root of it, is protest, all right, and that directly comes from the events of the Reformation. Within this new Protestant sect in Christianity, you get new religious groups that come about because of it, like Lutheranism, like Presbyterian, and kind of tying it into the study of U.S. history, also Puritanism. And last but not least, when you divide, you weaken, and that's what happens with it, okay? It's a weakening of the church overall. All right, guys, that wraps up this one on the Reformation. Appreciate you listening. Remember, if you're not in my classes, you can always go to my website, www.connorland.weebly.com, and get additional class materials and notes, whatever you need. And also, if you wouldn't mind, subscribe to the channel. Once again, appreciate you listening, and see you next time.